Hello, in this presentation, we're going to have an overview of Intacct non-financial reporting. We're going to provide an overview, discuss how to devise a plan if we want to take advantage of Intacct's abilities for reporting on non-financial data. We're going to look at dimensions, which is one aspect that can support this type of reporting, custom fields, which is another method, and lastly, we'll take a look at statistical accounts and some examples there on how we can take advantage of reporting on data not related to our finances. So we must understand the reporting and oversight processes we are subject to. This can vary by the type of funds that finance our programs, the goals and objectives we set or are set by a funding agency, and how much insight we're looking to have in decision making about how we deploy our financial resources or non-financial resources like people and property. Upkeeping of this data is the most challenging aspect of reporting. Financial reporting is automated for us when we submit a purchasing transaction that gets approved. All of the journal entries and data related to that is automatically made for us. Non-financial reporting, however, requires a plan for implementation, an action plan, and then the upkeep of maintaining the data we want to track. So let's look at devising a plan. And we have three components to doing this. First is identifying the data that needs visibility. What is important to us? What do we need to track? Formatting a plan. So how are we going to enable tracking the data we've identified we want to be able to see? And then lastly, putting this plan into action. Here's an example of some data that might need visibility by programs. We need to know our major goals and objectives. Every program operates very uniquely based on the services it provides the tribal members. So we want to take that into consideration when we talk about the data we want to track. That might be the number of people we're serving meals, the communities we're servicing for our program, miles we've driven in our vehicles, the gallons of water the tribe uses if we're from one of the water programs and we're tracking water use, number of patients we've transported to IHS, whether it's through transportation or ambulance services, the number of burials we've provided assistance for. We can use this to do sub-fund tracking, so we don't change your funding sources, but maybe through your funds, we're supporting a certain event, like an annual Christmas event or a toy drive, that kind of stuff. We can enable the ability to track it for heightened reporting. For the court, we might be tracking different types of cases we hear. Land leases, number of kids enrolled in school, number of beds taken. All the type of data that we can think of, there's stuff we can start to build to track in Intacct. So, formatting a plan. How do we track this information? Who is our audience? Is this information we're tracking for internal use only? Is this information we're going to share with our committees, with tribal council, with our funding agencies, or it's all of the above? And this may determine exactly how we want the information presented on a report. Are we going to use statistical accounts or dimensions? We'll go over those shortly. How do we want this information presented in a report? Well, depending on our audience, that may impact who we're sharing this information with or how we want it presented. If we were tracking meals served, we may not only want to track the number of meals we've served, we may also be wanting to track the number of people served meals, the number of meals per community, people per community, cost of the meals per community, food cost per person. We can really get into detailed information about what we want to track as long as we devise the plan of what we're going to track and how we're going to do it. Putting our plan into action. Now that we've identified what we want to track, who's going to be the key employees in building and tracking this information? Do they have the appropriate access in Intacct or appropriate access to the information through your program? Who or how will this information get into Intacct? How will this information be set up? What type of reports are we looking to utilize? Financial reports, our standard reports like general ledger reports. Are we going to have a custom report built for us to report on the information that we're starting to track and enter into Intacct? Maybe a custom dashboard that we can view to get better visibility of our information. So let's look at one of the first components we can use for reporting. And it's called dimensions. Dimension, by definition of Intacct, classification system that we use to organize, sort, and report on program information in meaningful ways. We can start by thinking of a dimension as a kind of reportable tag which we can associate with transactions and general ledger entries. Every transaction we enter has the option to be tagged with multiple dimension values to uniquely identify and report on it. That information gives us the ability to make data more visible and help us make better informed decisions. So what are dimensions? Well, here are the dimensions that Intacct currently uses. We use checkbook. As Intacct users, we're all familiar with the checkbooks that we get assigned to be able to use. Programs, everyone is assigned a program for use. So those are examples of dimensions. Funding source. We use a funding source on all of our purchasing requests. If we're using accounts receivable, we use that in our invoicing. Vendors. Anytime we make a purchase request, we use a vendor ID, and that is also a dimension. And within the vendor profile itself, we can add more information to report on. For example, in a vendor, we can identify the type of vendor it is to the tribe. So if this is an attorney, a CPA, contractor, construction, any type of category, we can identify those and then report on the vendors based on the type of vendor they are to the tribe. Employees, we use employee IDs so that the information that comes from Workforce Go can be received into Intacct, and we can report on our employees based on cost by period of time and the type of cost employees have coming from Workforce Go. Items, not something we think about a lot, but every time we do a purchasing transaction, we use an item and not a general ledger account. And this gives us the ability to specify the type of purchasing transaction we have. So let's go into Intacct and look at a travel request. When we go to add a travel request, of course we have the information that we'll attach, including the documents that support our travel, that kind of stuff. But once we get down to entering the lines, our program we want to charge, our funding source that will be billed, and the checkbook, we get to choose an item ID. So instead of just seeing one account, 60100 for travel and training, we actually see 20 different item IDs. And this gives us the ability to request purchasing related or travel related authorization, and then specify our cost of motel separate from baggage, separate from ATM fees, separate from per diem, separate from mileage, so that when we issue a travel check, we know exactly what the advance is for. On our financial reports, we'll see it as one line, 60100, so we don't see the 20 different item IDs broken out into that. But what this allows us to do is use other reports in Intacct, like the general ledger reports, so we can make visible what it is that we're spending the most money on as it concerns travel. So if we wanted to see the cost of per diem versus the cost of mileage versus the cost of motels, we can start to quantify that because we're using the item IDs. And then we also use a customer as an item ID. Many users in Intacct haven't seen the customer field or do not use it. But on our accounts receivable side, on our employee loan programs, we use customer to track additional information such as who is being billed. And this gives us the ability to not only assign the cost to a new dimension that we can use for tracking purposes, we can assign data to the customer. So for example, in the TELP program, tribal employees are allowed to borrow, and so are employees from other entities. So we use a field to identify where that person is from in terms of where they're employed. So then the TELP program can produce a report that says we have X dollars of accounts receivable. This is how much is due from tribal employees. This is how much is due from SWA, from the casino, and so on for all of their different organizations that TELP works with. We also have territory available as a dimension and class. All of us who've been doing purchasing transactions over the last year have become more familiar with class. As we're making a request for in purchasing, we now have the class field, of which the two more common ones we're using over the last year is COVID and regular. So we can identify the spending as related to COVID-19 when we're buying supplies to clean our offices to protect our employees, or if it's just regular day-to-day spending that we're doing for programs to keep operating. This gives us the ability to generate reports to see just how much money the tribe has spent in battling the pandemic over the last year. And we actually have an example we'll use later of another program that uses class for a different need. So common factors with dimensions is that they can be entered during the time of purchase, as we've just seen. These are actually selectable on Intacct default reports. So if we visit a general ledger report, we have our period of time, our general account information we can enter, but one of the required sections has a header called Dimension Filters, and it identifies all of the dimensions we just went through: program, checkbook, funding source, customer, vendor, employee, item, class. And so as we're building a report to draw information, this helps us specify specific information we want to see. We can filter out the things we don't want and then see only those we want to see. So beyond putting in our program and our checkbook, so this information is required of us at a minimum. We must have these two things in here in order to produce information. If I use this information now, we'll get information for all the spending, all the activity on our general ledger related to finance through checkbook 2. I can specify a funding source. So now it's going to be specific to this combination of dimensions. Nothing else will appear in the report. If Intacct was using a customer, or finance was using a customer, I can specify a customer. Now this is the only information that would be returned. And that works for vendors, for employees, for item IDs. If I only wanted to see the cost of mileage as it's related to travel and training, travel advances, I can choose that. Or if we wanted to report on the program and funding source expenditures as it relates to COVID-19, or spending on supplies and other relevant spending we've coded as COVID-19 class, we can use that and then produce a report that would only include that information. So this is the advantage of using dimensions to further our data, to make more visible information that's happening. And we can go so far as to making rules in Intacct that can be set to ensure that if a certain line item is used, that a dimension is required. And this helps in ensuring that the dimension is used consistently. And so we know from experience over the last year that there's 89 accounts currently that require the use of class of the 200 general ledger accounts used by the tribe. And so if we are going to use one of those account numbers and we attempt to submit a transaction without class or class is required, we would get an on-screen error message that won't allow us to submit the transaction until we've met that requirement. So if we opt to wanting to use class in some of our purchasing, this will help us make sure we're consistent so that every transaction is using that field, so that as our employees change or the user changes who's doing this, we're still getting the information track that we want to track. So we're going to look at a little example here from community services. Part of the community service program's service to tribal members is to provide burial and medical assistance to tribal members. Funding is received through the tribe's general fund and through the federal government. And they track burial assistance to identify changes in costs over time to help with anticipating future costs. They provide medical assistance through these account numbers, whether it's to provide burial services, which is the Aid to Families account number, client and family services, which is your general medical assistance, and long-term care through another account number for other individuals who need assistance for long-term care. So they wanted to leverage Intacct to track burial services or the number of instances and to be able to compare that to other periods. They want to track medical assistance, including the location of appointment where they're providing assistance for members to go to, and the type of appointment they're going to, medical, dental, and vision. Long-term care assistance, we added the ability to also track the location of an appointment. And so in discussing this at the time this was developed, we didn't want to add additional work to track later. We didn't want to have to rely on a single individual aggregating all this information and risk having that information lost if that person's not available to us anymore. And we wanted to use those three primary sources of expenditures. So as it comes to medical assistance and long-term care, we developed item IDs to further expand on the services being provided. So we can see on the boxes on the left, we're using an item ID using the same account number they've budgeted, 77,200, and we've added these sub-items that identifies the cities most commonly used in medical assistance requests for individuals. So Rapid City, Sioux Falls, out of state, Mitchell, Yankton, and so on. And then for long-term care on the right, we've done the same thing. So as the community service program processes requests to provide a person with monetary assistance, the employee preparing the request in Intacct can select from one of these based on the application they've received, so that at a later time they can report on, this is how much money we're spending to send people to Rapid City, Sioux Falls, or any of these others identified. So we identified the data we're going to report on client family services, which is the type of medical assistance, destination. We could have even taken it further if we wanted to identify the request as related to a flyout or an emergency versus just scheduled appointments. So let's take a look at what that looks like in action. And for that, we're going to go to the Community Services dashboard. Okay, so now that we're at the Community Services dashboard, we can see two reports prominently on the left and right. The report on the left is the item detail by client family services, the item being the sub number for Rapid City, Sioux Falls, and so forth. And from there, we can see the type of fund being used, and then the item numbers being used. And so this report's designed to show the fiscal year. And they're able to then look at this report and very easily determine how much money is being spent, but how much money is being spent by location people are being sent to for their appointments. And then the report on the right provides a breakout by class. So we get some of the same information we see on the left, but we've also broken out so people can see the cost by dental or medical, and if vision's used, vision. So hopefully this provides community services with more visible information about what they're spending to make decisions about the monetary cost of sending people there or other information that's important to them. Custom Field offers a way to capture data that's unique to a program, a workflow, or a situation. So during this overview, we're going to look at two examples where we use custom fields. Travel request is one, and then the prior current year options on payment requests. Now, the thing about custom fields is it's not selectable in Intacct's reports. So if we're utilizing a custom field, when we go to run a general ledger report, that's not something that's an option to us to be able to see. Custom reports, though, can be built using custom fields and can be used to prompt report results. So here's an example of the travel request area. So we have a custom field in the middle of the document where we identify the employee that's traveling, which is important because the request might not always be directly for the employee. If it's for registration fees or to a travel agency, that kind of thing. You need to be able to track the employee who's traveling. We have a custom field for a trip description or purchase. So if it's the name of the conference, a brief description of what the purpose of the trip is for. We get to use the travel time, travel start date, travel start time, same thing with the end date and end time. Let's take a look at the actual fields in action. So here's those fields. The nice thing about trip description is it's a text area, so we can type whatever the description is. We're not limited to having to use a certain amount of information. Travel start date and the end date, we see the calendar, so we have to choose a date that's formatted the same for everybody. So we're not going to have to experience data that might not match because one person types 2/17/21 and the other one types February 17, 2021, or the variations that can happen there. The start and end times, we use a drop-down box that specifies and asks for you basically to round to the nearest hour that you'll be traveling. So this ensures the same data is being used across all requests. And then we have city, state, and destination. So we can plug in there where we're going to end up. And this is also a text field, so it's subject to how an individual types, whether we're using the full name of a city or we're abbreviating certain things like Saint, S-A-I-N-T, or S-T period. The same thing for states, SD for South Dakota, or typing out South Dakota. So that gives us some variation, not as much control as we see up here. But with custom fields, we also see we use it for fiscal year end. And so when we're processing non-PO vouchers or our voucher payments, justifications, we have the opportunity to select whether or not it's for the current fiscal year or whether the payment is from the prior year. This field serves as a reminder to users that if they're selecting prior year, that should be an indication to them that the date on the transaction should be changed to match the prior year so we can accrue the expense to the proper period. This also helps us identify any potential errors. So we're able to run a report that shows prior but where the date doesn't match that, so that's a possible indication that we've accrued a transaction to the wrong period. So using custom fields may require new workflows. If we created a custom field specific to a program, an existing workflow may have this new document added to it so that the other programs do not have to worry about the rules that may be put into place. So if we wanted to have a custom field tracking the community we're using for a service, might not be relevant to anyone else, but for that program it is. So that may require a separate workflow than the ones we're accustomed to using now. Statistical accounts in action. So besides dimensions, besides custom fields, we can use something called statistical accounts. So these are used to track non-financial data, headcounts for employees, customers, clients, number of contracts, number of jail cells, locations, vacancy for our treatment facility, pretty much any kind of data we want to track. And this gives us the ability to increase or decrease that account number that we're tracking. Statistical accounts are completely customizable in how they are named. Unlike dimensions, a statistical account isn't something that gets tracked during purchasing or revenue transactions. This is something that gets updated by journal entry. Data can be kept on a spreadsheet and then imported into Intacct, so we don't have to constantly be doing journal entries. We can move this information on a frequency that is determined to be the best amount of time. Non-financial, so data can be entered for this current fiscal year or going backwards. If we've decided that this is something we want to take advantage of, we're not limited to just starting once we've created this information. We can import that information going backwards to heighten the reports you're using now. If we wanted to use dimensions or custom fields, we can't go backwards and address the transactions we've already done. We'd only be able to start once that information is designed for us to use, and then going forward. But with statistical accounts, we can put this information in for all the periods of time that we feel are relevant. So I put something into action here for commodity foods. They have a report from the Department of Agriculture called the Annual Summary of Food and Nutrition Service Programs, which summarizes commodity supplement foods for 5 years for all of Department of Agriculture. And so based on looking at this report, I modeled a sample report on this example. This could be a good way to compare our program costs versus the rest of the industry. And as we can see on this report, this gives us the two key information: the number of people participating in the commodity supplemental foods, and the cost of delivering those services to people. So this can give us a simple cost per person delivery so that we know how effective we're being year over year. Or by taking the national data and then using ours, are we just as effective as the rest of everyone? So I built a financial report and included some statistical information. This information is just theoretical, so this isn't actual commodity information. But what I built was 3 different lines. I created a statistical account for people participating, another for households participating, and then the value of benefits. And so, for example, in the month of October, I had put in there that 1,000 people had received commodities, and that those 1,000 people resided in 450 households, and that the cost for the month of October was $20,000. So we can track that monthly as shown here, where I've just created a sample amount of information. And if this were accurate information, we would see that the commodities cost per participant is $20. Just a simple formula being used to say the cost of the value of benefits, the $20,000, divided by 1,000 people is 20. And you can see the month-over-month cost on how effective the program could be or is performing, the monthly calculation of the number of people participating. And like I said, this data is just theoretical and doesn't actually reflect any real information that commodities may be tracking. And the nice thing about using this information in Intacct is many of us are already tracking our information through Excel spreadsheets or another form in our programs. Is if your computer that you use crashes, you don't risk the loss of this information, as these are stored on Intacct servers, which are backed up with our information to guarantee access. Also, this information becomes accessible anywhere you are. So while many of us probably cannot access our computers remotely when we're traveling or we're meeting with our funding agency, that kind of stuff, this data becomes accessible through your phones, laptops, and other devices because we've been maintaining it in Intacct and we can view this information at any time. Another sample I've used is Head Start. They have a report called Funded Enrollment by Program Option. This is from the Office of Head Start Services Snapshot for American Indian and Alaska Native all programs. And so we can see that the number of people or children enrolled in center-based Head Start services is 20,964 across all Head Start programs in the nation. And then there's other categories that there's being tracked as well, whether it's home-based services, family child care, locally designed, total funded pregnant women. And similar to the commodity foods example, I've modeled a report similar to this that if this was a report we wanted to take advantage of, we can use this to compare our performance versus the performance of the Head Start programs across the country. So here's that sample. Same statistical data, and then just some theoretical data I had put together so we could see month-over-month enrollment or the total number of enrollment by month, and then of course for the fiscal year. We could use this information with our expenses to determine the cost of operating Head Start by child. We could further expand on this if we wanted to track each of our Head Start centers, so then we can start to develop an understanding of which centers have the most children, which centers cost us the most based on our expenses, and really get into some statistical information that was almost limitless in what we want to look at. Okay, so thank you for watching this. You can find me at the email address on screen. If you have more questions about how you could track certain types of information, and if you have an idea of what you wanted to do, feel free to reach me. Thank you and have a good day.